Alara's breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale forming a ghostly mist in the freezing air. The wind howled through the ancient pines, whipping up the snow into swirling, blinding curtains. Her fingers, wrapped in thick wool gloves, trembled as she clutched her leather satchel. Inside, wrapped carefully in cloth, were a few strands of Rituet lean, snow lotus roots, one of the rarest medicinal plants known to grow only in the depths of winter. She had risked everything to find them, and now she was lost. The storm had rolled in faster than she had expected. One moment, the sky was a crisp winter blue. The next, it had turned into an ominous shade of gray, thick with the weight of impending doom. Alara had tried to retrace her steps, following the small orange ribbons she had tied to tree branches. But the wind had torn them away. The forest was a blur of white, and her tracks were vanishing as quickly as she made them. She pulled out her phone with numb fingers. No signal, not even a single bar. She swallowed hard. She had ventured too far from the village, too deep into the wild. Her heartbeat quickened. Alara had spent most of her life studying traditional medicine, following in the footsteps of her late grandfather. She had always been drawn to the knowledge of the ancients, the secrets held within plants, roots, and herbs that could heal. When she heard of a rare patch of snow lotus growing in the northern wilderness, she had set out without hesitation. She told herself she was prepared. Now, she wasn't so sure. The cold gnawed at her, seeping through her thick coat. She had to find shelter. She had to stay calm. Taking a deep breath, she scanned her surroundings. The trees were tall and skeletal, their leafless branches clawing at the sky. The snow, knee-deep, made every step a struggle. Her boots crunched with each movement, the sound swallowed by the howling wind. Then, she felt it. Presence. A prickling sensation crawled up her spine, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Slowly, she turned her head, peering through the snowy haze. Glowing eyes. Her breath hitched. One pair, then two, then more, emerging from the shadows of the trees, just beyond the reach of her vision. Wolves. Pack. Their dark forms blended into the storm, only their luminous eyes giving them away. They stood still, silent, their breath visible in the icy air. Alara's pulse pounded in her ears. She had read about wolves, about how they hunted in coordinated silence, how they stalked their prey for miles before striking. But she also knew that they rarely attacked humans, unless they were desperate or starving. The winter had been brutal this year. The deep snows had likely driven away the smaller prey, leaving the pack with little food. And here she was, alone, vulnerable, an easy target. Alara tightened her grip on her satchel, her mind racing. She couldn't outrun them. Running would only trigger their instincts to chase. She needed to think. Slowly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a flare gun, her only real defense. Her hands shook as she loaded it. One of the wolves took a step closer, its muscles rippling beneath its thick fur, its head lowered, ears flat against its skull. A warning. Alara swallowed hard. She had to act. Lifting the flare gun, she fired into the sky. The explosion of red light illuminated the storm for a brief moment, casting eerie shadows across the snow-covered ground. The wolves recoiled, startled by the sudden brightness and the loud hiss of the flare. It bought her a few seconds. She turned and ran. Her legs burned as she trudged through the deep snow, her lungs screaming for air. The cold wind slashed at her face. But she didn't stop. She needed to find shelter, somewhere she could make a fire, somewhere she could wait out the night. Then, through the haze, she saw it. A cabin, half buried in snow. The wooden structure was barely visible through the storm. But it was real. It was there. With every ounce of strength she had left, she pushed forward, reaching the door just as a distant howl echoed behind her. She didn't look back. Throwing herself inside, she slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. For a moment, she just stood there, gasping for breath. The cabin was small, the air stale, but it was shelter. A fireplace sat in the corner, a pile of logs stacked beside it. She wasted no time. Her fingers were numb as she struck a match, lighting the kindling beneath the old logs. The flames flickered, then grew, casting warmth and light into the tiny space. Outside, the wind howled. She backed away from the door, sinking to the floor, exhaustion washing over her. She had made it, for now, but she knew the wolves were still out there, waiting, and the night was long. Ilara's hands trembled as she pressed them against her stomach, trying to calm the sharp pangs spreading through her body. Her breathing was shallow, labored not from exhaustion, but from something more primal, something she hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just fear. This was pain. Her child too soon. The fire crackled weakly in the small cabin, but the warmth it provided felt insignificant against the growing storm outside. She could hear the howling wind, the relentless push of winter against the fragile wooden walls. But worse than the storm was what lurked beyond it. The wolves. A chorus of howls echoed through the trees, closer now, surrounding her. Their glowing eyes flickered in the darkness just beyond the frosted windows. She knew they were testing her, waiting for the right moment. They had smelled her weakness, her vulnerability. Ilara reached for the flare gun, her grip tight despite her shaking hands. It had bought her time before, but one flare wouldn't keep them away forever. She knew they were patient, and she was running out of options. Then, the crunch of snow. Closer. The wolves were moving. Through the swirling snow outside, their dark forms emerged. A dozen, maybe more, their fur bristling, their breath coming in visible puffs in the freezing air. Their eyes locked onto her, hungry and determined. Ilara sucked in a shaky breath. She had read about wolves in survival guides, heard stories of their cunning and coordination. But reading about them and facing them were two very different things. The alpha took a step forward, a massive, silver-gray beast with scars lining its muzzle. It bared its teeth, saliva glistening in the dim light. Ilara's heart pounded. She had to do something. Her fingers tightened around the flare gun. But before she could lift it, a roar, deep, thunderous. It rolled through the trees like an earthquake, shaking the very air around her. The wolves froze. Ilara's breath hitched as a massive shadow loomed in the blizzard, parting the white veil like a force of nature itself. Then she saw it. A bear. Not just any bear. A grizzly, an enormous one, its thick fur dusted with snow, its eyes burning with a fierce, untamed intelligence. Its powerful limbs moved with a slow, deliberate grace, and when it stood on its hind legs, it towered over everything in sight. The wolves growled, hesitant. Ilara's pulse pounded in her ears. This was no ordinary bear. Something about it seemed familiar. Then she saw the scar. A long, jagged mark running down its front leg, half hidden beneath its fur. A memory stirred in her mind. Years ago, she had been younger, only a child, following her grandfather into the woods to collect herbs. He had been the village healer, a man of great knowledge and even greater kindness. That day, they had stumbled upon a wounded bear, this bear. Its leg had been caught in a trap. The steel teeth had bitten deep, infection setting in. She had watched as her grandfather, fearless and calm, approached the massive creature, slowly, carefully, speaking in a low, soothing voice. She had been terrified, clutching his coat as he worked, using salves and herbs to ease the bear's suffering. The bear had watched them with wary, intelligent eyes, but it had never attacked. And when they left, it had limped away, disappearing into the wild. Now, standing between her and the wolves, the same bear held its ground. A protector. The alpha wolf snarled, stepping forward. The bear responded with another earth-shaking roar, dropping to all fours, muscles coiled like steel cables. The wolves hesitated. This was no ordinary fight. They outnumbered the bear, but they knew the price of challenging something so much bigger, stronger. The alpha growled, a warning. The bear took a step forward. The air between them was thick with tension. an unspoken battle of dominance. Then, the first wolf lunged. The bear moved like a landslide, swift and unstoppable. A single swipe of its massive paw sent the attacker sprawling into the snow with a yelp. Another wolf snapped at its flank, only to be met with crushing force as the bear turned with a speed that defied its size. Alara could only watch in stunned silence. The wolves fought with precision, darting in and out, trying to wear the bear down. But the bear was relentless, every move calculated, every strike devastating. Then, piercing pain shot through Alara's body. She gasped, doubling over. The contractions were stronger now, her body betraying her. Not now. Not here. She clutched her stomach, willing herself to stay conscious. She needed to stay awake, to survive. Outside, the battle raged. The wolves, realizing the fight was turning against them, began to retreat. The alpha snarled in frustration, but even it knew when to cut its losses. With one final growl, turned and vanished into the snow, the others following close behind. Silence. Only the sound of Alara's ragged breathing and the wind remained. She looked up. The bear stood at the edge of the cabin, its massive form silhouetted against the storm. Its breath came in heavy huffs, its fur streaked with blood, but it was not defeated. It watched her, those deep, intelligent eyes locking onto hers. She wanted to speak, to say something, but before she could, the bear turned and disappeared into the night, leaving only its enormous paw prints in the snow. Alara slumped against the doorframe, her vision blurring. She wasn't alone. Somewhere, in the heart of the wild, something had watched over her. And for now, that was enough. Alara clutched her stomach, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps as another wave of pain racked her body. Her vision blurred, but her mind remained sharp, sharp enough to understand the gravity of her situation. She was deep in the wilderness, in the dead of winter, with no medical help. The child inside her was coming too soon, and there was no stopping it. The bear, the same grizzly that had just saved her from the wolves, stood a few feet away, its massive form still and unmoving, except for the slow rise and fall of its breath. Snow swirled around it like ghostly tendrils, but it did not leave. It watched her, and then, as another sharp pain lanced through her, a long-buried memory surfaced. 15 years ago, she had been a child, no more than 10, following closely behind her grandfather as they trekked through the thick winter forest. He had been a healer, wise and patient, always moving with a quiet reverence for the world around him. She had idolized him, watching as he plucked herbs and spoke of their ancient uses. That day, they had found something unexpected. A bear cub small, trembling, his fur matted with blood. It had been caught in a hunter's trap, the cruel metal teeth biting deep into its hind leg. The poor creature had been too weak to cry out, too exhausted to fight. Alara had been terrified, but her grandfather had approached the cub without hesitation. All creatures feel pain, he had told her as he knelt by the suffering animal. Even the fiercest beasts deserve kindness. Together, they had worked to free the cub. She had held its tiny head in her lap while her grandfather carefully applied a poultice made from the very same riz-tuet she had spent days searching for. She had looked into the cub's eyes that day, dark, filled with pain but also something else. A deep, quiet intelligence. When the cub had finally been strong enough to stand, it had lingered for a moment, staring at her as if committing her face to memory, before disappearing into the wild. And now, as she gazed at the enormous grizzly standing before her, she knew this was the same bear. It had survived. It had grown. And somehow, it had not forgotten. Alara let out a breathless laugh, though it was cut short by another sharp contraction. She doubled over, pressing a hand to the wooden cabin wall for support. The pain was coming faster now. She was out of time. A deep, rumbling sound pulled her attention back to the bear. But it wasn't a growl. It was something else. A low, rhythmic sound, vibrating through the air like the echo of a distant drum. A deep, almost melodic rumble that resonated through her chest. A song. Alara blinked, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was hearing. Bears didn't sing. And yet this one was. The sound wasn't hostile. It wasn't aggressive. It was calming, protective, as if summoned by the strange, ancient melody. Movement stirred in the darkness beyond the trees. More figures emerged, their massive forms blending seamlessly with the swirling snow. Bears. At least 3 more, each one enormous. Their thick winter coats dusted in frost. Their eyes reflecting the dim firelight from the cabin. Alara's breath caught in her throat. They weren't attacking. They were forming a circle around her. A shield. For a moment, she could do nothing but stare. The primal part of her mind told her to fear them, to run, to hide. But another part of her, the part that had spent her life learning the delicate balance of nature, knew better. These creatures were not here to harm her. They were here to protect her. The singing bear, the one she now knew had been her cub from years ago, stepped closer, lowering itself onto all fours. Its dark eyes met hers, filled with something she could not name, something ancient, something sacred. And then, the pain came again, stronger than before. Alara gasped, falling to her knees in the snow. Her body was taking over. Instincts she couldn't fight driving her toward the inevitable. She was going to give birth. Here, now. A wave of panic surged through her, but before it could consume her, the bear let out another deep, resonant sound, and something in that sound grounded her. She wasn't alone. She had survived this long. She would survive this, too. With shaking hands, she pulled off her thick coat, laying it beneath her as best she could. She positioned herself near the warmth of the fire, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The bears did not leave. They stood watch, their presence a silent promise that nothing would reach her tonight. The wind howled outside, but inside the circle of giants, there was only stillness. And then, through the pain, through the storm, through the ancient song that surrounded her, a cry, a new life, fragile but strong, entering the world beneath the watchful eyes of nature's greatest beasts. Tears blurred Alara's vision as she held her child against her chest, feeling the tiny heartbeat against her own. She had survived. They both had. The largest bear, the one she now knew had been her cub, once so small and helpless, stepped forward, lowering its great head. For a long moment, Alara and the bear simply looked at one another. And in that moment, she understood. 15 years ago, she had saved it. And tonight, it had saved her. Somewhere, in the endless cycle of nature, in the quiet and brutal balance of the wild, this had been meant to happen. This had been destiny. The bear let out one final, low rumble, then turned, leading its kin back into the depths of the snow-covered forest, leaving her safe, leaving her forever changed. The storm had passed. Alara barely noticed when the howling winds died down, when the swirling snow settled like a soft blanket over the earth. She was too lost in the moment, in the fragile heartbeat against her chest, in the warmth of new life pressed against her skin. Her child, a miracle born in the heart of the wilderness, cradled in the arms of a mother who had fought against the storm, against the odds, against the cold grip of fear itself. She lifted her head, exhausted yet strangely at peace. The fire inside the cabin flickered low, casting long shadows against the wooden walls. But beyond its glow, the true magic of the night was unfolding. The northern lights, brilliant, shimmering curtains of green and blue danced across the sky, illuminating the snow-covered landscape in an ethereal glow. It was as if the heavens themselves had opened, welcoming this new soul into the world with a celestial embrace. And she was not alone. The bears remained. They stood in a circle around her, their massive forms bathed in the otherworldly light. But they did not move. They did not leave. Instead, they began to sing. It was not the guttural growls of beasts, nor the aggressive roars of dominance. It was something older, something primal yet gentle. A deep, resonant hum, vibrating through the ground, through the very air itself. It was a song, not just a sound, but a feeling, a connection that ran deeper than words, deeper than time itself. Alara closed her eyes, letting the rhythmic vibrations settle into her bones. It was familiar, somehow, a legend, a memory from the old stories her grandfather used to tell her, of the Inuit shamans who spoke of the song of the earth, the ancient melody carried by the great bears, the wolves, the wind, the trees, a song of protection, of healing. And now, she was hearing it, not in a dream, not in a myth, but here, now. She looked down at the tiny face nestled against her chest. Her child's skin was warm against her own, their breathing soft and steady, a life untouched by the chaos of the world, yet already woven into the fabric of something much greater. This child did not belong to her alone. They belonged to the forest, to the snow, to the song. A sharp gust of wind sent a flurry of snowflakes into the air, but the cold did not touch her. The bears stood as a shield, their fur catching the frost, their massive bodies forming a protective circle. Then, the largest bear, the one she knew, without a doubt, was the same cub she had once saved, stepped forward. It moved slowly, deliberately, until it was only inches away. Its dark eyes locked onto hers, filled with something ancient, something knowing. Then, with the gentleness of a whisper, it lowered its great head and touched its nose to the child's forehead. Alara gasped. A warmth spread through her, radiating outward like ripples on a still lake. It was not heat, not fire, but something deeper, a warmth that settled into her bones, into her soul. Protection, blessing, a gift from the wild itself. The child stirred, a tiny hand reaching up as if to grasp something unseen. Then, as if answering a call only they could hear, the baby let out their first true cry. The sound rang out, pure and strong, and in that moment, the forest answered. From the shadows of the trees, other creatures emerged, silent watchers, pair of wolves, their silver fur glistening under the aurora's glow. An owl, perched atop a snow-laden branch, its golden eyes wide and unblinking. A herd of deer, their delicate hooves barely making a sound against the frozen ground. They stood together, a gathering of the wild, drawn to something beyond instinct, as if they, too, understood. The great bear rumbled one last time, a deep sound that resonated through the earth. Then, one by one, the others began to leave. The wolves melted back into the trees. The deer disappeared into the snow. The owl spread its great wings and took flight, vanishing into the night sky. Only the bear remained for a moment longer. Then, with a final glance, one that spoke of something more than gratitude, something that felt like destiny, it turned and disappeared into the darkness. The song had ended. The night was quiet once more. Alara exhaled, tears slipping down her cheeks, not from sadness, nor fear, but from something deeper. Something like understanding. She pulled her child closer, pressing a soft kiss against their tiny forehead. "You are more than just mine," she whispered. The wind outside had softened, carrying the scent of pine and fresh snow. Her child stirred, their breathing steady and calm. They would grow strong, they would grow wise, and they would always, always be watched over, not just by her, but by the wild itself. The first light of dawn broke through the heavy clouds, casting a soft golden glow across the snow-covered landscape. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that glistened in quiet majesty. The forest stood still, its towering pines blanketed in white, their branches bending under the weight of the frost. Alara sat just outside the cabin, her back against the wooden wall, cradling her newborn in her arms. The exhaustion still clung to her muscles, but a new energy coursed through her veins, something beyond adrenaline, beyond mere survival. It was as if she had been reborn alongside her child, tethered now to something greater than herself. The great bear lingered nearby, its dark eyes watching her with an expression that almost felt knowing. Around them, the other bears had begun to retreat into the depths of the wilderness, their massive forms disappearing one by one into the shadows of the trees. They had done their part. And yet, the largest one, the one she knew had once been the injured cub she had saved, remained. It stood tall, this powerful form framed by the morning light, its breath visible in the crisp air. There was no fear in its stance, no aggression, only a deep, unshakable presence. A guardian. Then, the distant crunch of boots on snow. Alara's head snapped up. Someone was coming. She clutched the child protectively against her chest, her instincts flaring to life once more. But before panic could take hold, she recognized the figure emerging from the trees. James, her husband. He moved quickly, his heavy coat dusted with frost, his breath coming in quick bursts. His hazel eyes were wide, filled with urgency until they landed on her, and the baby in her arms. He froze. Alara. His voice was barely a whisper, thick with disbelief and relief all at once. He took a shaky step forward, his gaze locked onto hers. But then, he saw the bear, his body tensed, one hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife at his belt. No, Alara's voice was firm, steady despite her exhaustion. It's all right. James' eyes darted between her and the massive beast that stood just feet away. The rational part of his mind screamed at him that this was impossible. That a bear, an apex predator, shouldn't be standing so close, shouldn't be watching over them with something that felt like reverence. Then, the child stirred. James watched as Alara shifted slightly, holding the newborn closer to her chest. And in that moment, as the infant let out a tiny sound, something happened. It wasn't a normal cry. It was something else. The sound that came from the baby's lips was soft, almost melodic, an echo of something ancient and wild. It was human, yet layered with a deeper resonance, something akin to the low, rhythmic rumbles that the bear had sung the night before. James' breath caught in his throat. The bear tilted its head, its ears twitching as if listening, understanding. James took a step back, shaking his head. What is this? Alara exhaled, her gaze filled with something that James couldn't quite name. It's more than I can explain. She looked down at their child, at the tiny fingers curled against her chest. But I know this isn't just a baby. James took another step closer, his hand slowly falling away from his knife. He crouched beside her, his eyes locked onto the child's face. The newborn's bright, curious eyes blinked up at him, unfazed by the cold, by the world, by the enormous bear standing mere feet away. Then, the great bear did something that made James' breath catch once more. It looked at him, not just in the way an animal watches a human, but with something deeper, a recognition, a quiet acceptance. Then, slowly, the bear gave a slight nod, a gesture that, impossibly, felt like a greeting, a welcome. James swallowed hard. His entire life had been built on logic, on order, on the belief that the wild was something to be respected but never truly understood. And yet, here he was, kneeling in the snow, face to face with something beyond reason, beyond explanation. And in his arms was the proof, their child born not just to them, but to the forest itself. His hands trembled as he reached out, gently brushing his fingers against the baby's tiny hand. What do we call them? He asked, his voice quiet, reverent. Alara smiled softly, her gaze drifting toward the sky. The aurora still shimmered faintly in the early morning light, its colors fading but not forgotten, a reminder of the night before, of the magic they had witnessed. Aurora, she whispered. Aurora Quinn. James exhaled, the name settling in his chest like a quiet truth. Aurora, the light that had guided them, the bridge between two worlds. As if in approval, the great bear let out one final, deep rumble, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the air itself. Then, with one last glance at the child, turned and began its slow, powerful retreat into the forest. Alara and James watched as it vanished between the trees, its massive form becoming one with the wilderness once more. And yet, they knew, it was not truly gone. It would always be watching, always protecting. As James finally wrapped his arms around both Alara and Aurora, holding them close, he realized that nothing would ever be the same. They had been changed, not just by the storm, not just by the birth of their child, but by something much greater. A connection to the wild, a legacy written in the frost, in the ancient songs of the earth. As they began their slow journey back home, Alara glanced over her shoulder one last time. Somewhere, deep in the forest, she swore she heard it, a distant hum, low and steady, the song of the bears. And as she held Aurora close, she knew that her child would always hear it too. For Aurora Quinn was not just a child of man. She was a child of the wild. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.